Hey, what's up? It's John from Coding Addict, and welcome to another HTML and CSS Nuggets video. And in this video, I'll show you how I created my default CSS starter for all my projects and recordings. So if you haven't watched any of my project videos, you know that CSS is already prepared. And since I've been getting a bunch of questions about the CSS setup, I decided to spend an entire video on that. So in this video, I'll show you where to get fonts, how to set up color shades, and few nifty element default styles. And the whole idea behind the default setup, or you can also call it global styles, is to make sure that as you move from project to project, you don't have to repeat yourself. And trust me, in the long run, it saves a lot of time and tedious, boring work. Lastly, if you want to see my default styles in action, just navigate to defaultstarter.netlify.app. Again, the URL is defaultstarter.netlify.app. And you can find the entire source code on GitHub. Just look for my profile, John Smilga, and then the repo name is default starter. All right, and let's kick things off by setting up a general structure. So basically a folder with index.html and a style sheet. So in my case, I'm going to navigate back to my desktop and I'm going to create a new folder and I'll name this default starter. Then I'm going to open up my text editor and drag and drop. Now I'll right away set up the browser side by side. So let me open up a new window and I'll set it side by side. So that way we'll be able to see right away some changes on a small browser window, and then I'll also open up the same port on the big browser as well. And in here, I want to create a new file, index.html, and then since Emmet is built in to the Visual Studio Code, of course, I can just go with exclamation mark, and I'll right away get my basic structure. As far as the title, I'm just going to go with default starter, and then we're going to start with heading one with hello world. We'll save that one. And now, of course, we also want to create the style sheet. Now you can call this style CSS, main CSS, or whatever your heart desires. In my case, I'm going to go with the main CSS. And of course, in the index.html, we want to set up a link. But before we do that, why don't we target a body? We'll add a background of red, just so we can see that everything works. And this is just going to be temporary, but I'll also add a padding. I'll say 2 REMs top bottom and then 5 REMs left and right. Of course, I don't use that in my global styles, but as we're setting them up, I think it's going to make a little bit more sense if we have some distance in our document. I'll save it here and then back in the index.html, I want to set up my links. Now, eventually there's going to be one for normalize as well, but we'll start with our main CSS. So here, let's add a path. And we're going to be looking for main CSS. And let's just add a comment here, main CSS. And like I said, eventually there's going to be one for normalize. And don't worry, I'll talk about it more once we get there. And then as far as my dev server, I use this extension when I'm working with just straight up HTML and CSS. Of course, if I'm working with React, then it's create a React app. If I'm working with Gatsby, then it's another starter, and hopefully you get the gist. But if I work with just HTML and CSS, I use this extension, preview on web server. And once you install the extension, of course, you just need to go with a snippet, or you can right click. So now let me close the docs for the extension. And if you want to go with a snippet, I believe it was, at least on a Mac, Shift, Control, and then L. And if you don't want to use the snippet, then of course you can always just right click and notice here. You'll have VS Code, Preview, Server. And like I said, the snippet is Control, Shift, and L. Hopefully that's what I said before. So I'm just going to open this up. And it's going to be looking for localhost 8080 and then index.html. So grab that URL. Copy and paste on a big browser window as well. And then once I have all of this in place, I'm just going to head back to the main CSS. And I'll remove that background red because I do find it a bit annoying, but it was necessary since I wanted to see whether our connection is correct. And once we have all of this in place, now we can talk about our next topic. Beautiful. And up next, I want to set up a few HTML elements just so we can see our CSS in action. Now, we're not going to go nuts. Few headings and paragraphs will do the job just fine. So I'm going to hop back to our project, and then right after the hello world, I'm going to go with paragraph. I'll add 20 words, and I'll copy and paste the whole thing. So select the heading, and then copy and paste, including the paragraph, and then change this to a heading 2. And then I want to set up 5 headings, starting with heading 1 all the way down to heading 5. Then 1 link, and also the unordered list with few list items. So right after the second paragraph, we're going to go with heading 1. We'll say hello world, and then we'll just copy and paste and change these values around. Heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, and heading 5. And what do we have next? Then we have our link. So let's set up here. Now I'm going to set this up as a dummy link. So I'll just add a hashtag, and I'll say link example or example link, however you want to call it. And then also we want to go with that unordered list. And in this case, I'm just going to use the emet. I'll say that I want unordered list. And then we're going to go with 3 list items. So times 3. And as far as the values, we'll say first item, and then second item, and then the third item, of course. So let's go here to the last line. Maybe I can just copy and paste, and we'll say third. And with our HTML in place, now, of course, we can move on to our next topic. Nice. And once our general setup is in place, let's start tackling the actual styles. And the first thing that I want in our project is Normalize CSS, which effectively provides a cross-browser consistency in the default styling of HTML elements. You can also think of Normalize as a blank canvas, since it handles some weird browser default styles. And in the process, allows us to focus only on our own style sheet. And if you're familiar with this code, so star and then margin 0, padding 0, and box sizing, border box, effectively it's the same idea, but of course using Normalize is a way more serious approach since it handles way more use cases and is far better battle tested. And as far as the install, we just need to go to the docs, and then if you use npm in your project, then of course you can just go with npm install and then Normalize CSS. And depending on a project, so if you're using React, then you just need to import the Normalize CSS into your index.js or app.js. But since we just use straight up HTML and CSS, we need to go with download option. That's going to get the latest version, and then just select the whole code. Now, at this point, you have 2 options. You can either create a separate file, which is going to be our route, or I've also seen some people just copy and paste the entire code that you have in Normalize CSS into your main CSS. Just remember though, whatever styles you'll add, you need to add after. So all the styles that we are about to set up later, you need to add after the Normalize CSS. Again, it's not going to be the route that we're going to take. We're going to set up a separate file, but yes, it is also an option to copy and paste your styles into your main style sheet. And I have seen some instances where people do that. So in my case, I'm just going to copy this. Then I'll create a new file and we'll say normalize. And we're looking for CSS, of course, paste. And then in the index HTML, above the main CSS link, you want to set up one for normalize as well. So we go here with link. We're going to go style CSS, of course, but we'll have to change this around where we're looking for normalize CSS. And then once you save, you should see some changes to your project. And once we have normalized in the project, now let's start dealing with bigger beasts with fonts and colors. Beautiful. And up next, we're going to tackle fonts. And if you're anything like me, and picking the correct fonts for your project is always a major pain, after you're done with this video, if you're not, it's not going to be the case anymore. When it comes to fonts in general, there are 2 steps. First, we need to choose our fonts, typically for the headings and then rest of the document. And second, we need to set up some default styles like line height and margins. And as far as picking the fonts, if you utilize the search engine, you'll find tons of great resources. But here are the two that I like the most: a site by the name of Front Pair and the blog post in a page cloud. As far as the font pair, the way it works, effectively, you have option to go for popular fonts. So these are the popular fonts you can choose from. And also they provide this nice list of sites and display what fonts the site is using. And of course, you can just go for the entire list, keep on scrolling, and pick whichever makes the most sense to you. And as a quick sign out, our next topic is going to be picking colors for the project. And if you ever need an inspiration, you can always use the font pair as well, since not only we can see the fonts, but we also get this nifty color palette with the colors that the site is using. That should do it for the font pair. And when it comes to the second resource, the page cloud, the idea is similar, where essentially you just get a list of suggestions for great font pairings. So pick whichever makes the most sense to you. And then once you have decided on the fonts, then of course we need to utilize our third resource, the type scale site. And what's really cool about the site is that right away provides some nice default values when it comes to the line height and margins and all that. So bravely click here, again, assuming that you have picked your fonts. And in my case, I'll try to pronounce them correctly, fonts that I picked. But if I don't, my apologies. And essentially, as of now, I like the spectral for the headings and Carla for the body one. And in a type scale, first, I need to enter the value for the heading ones. And notice here how we can change some default values as well. For example, if you don't like 16 as your base style, you can go with lower or higher. Then, of course, we can also change the scaling if we want. And in here, this is where we enter the heading one. And like I said, for the heading, I go with the spectral one. We have here spectral. And as far as the weight, I'm just going to leave it as 400. And then if I want to enter for the body, then of course, I just click here. And this is where we need to provide the value for the body font. Now, by default, it's just going to go same as heading. So let's go here and then let's look for the Carla one. And we enter that value as well. And again, you can change some values here around if you want. As far as my setup, I just always go with the default one, since I have a strong belief that whoever set up this site is way more knowledgeable in fonts than me. So we just go here with grab CSS, and effectively we're gonna copy everything starting with an import all the way down to a small text. So grab these lines of code and of course navigate back to the project, and I'll leave the body one. Like I said, this is just temporary. So maybe in order to avoid the confusion, I'll just say temp, copy and paste, and place it here as well. And then paste all the styles from the type scale. And just like that, we have added some nice fonts to our project. And before we move on to the colors, let's go over the code they provide. And after that, I'll show you my tweaks. They start by importing the fonts that we have selected. Then they set up the font size to be 100%, unless, of course, you change the base value for the pixels, and 100% just represents 16 pixels. They have some background and a color for the body, but once we set up our own color values, we will change this around. As far as the font family, well, whatever you picked for the body, font weight, line height 1.75. Then they select all the paragraphs, add margin bottom 1 rem to them. And then we have all the headings. Margin top is 3 rems, then 0 left and right, and then 1.3 rems in the bottom. Font family, again, whatever you picked. Font weight 400, and then line height 1.3. Then all the heading ones have margin top 0, and then they just set up the font size. So this is going to be 3 point something REMs, and then all the way down to a heading 5. And at the very end, they have the small and text small. Essentially, the small element is going to get the font size of 0.8 REMs, and then also they add this class of text small. That should do it for the code overview. And as far as the changes that I always apply to the code, well, for starters, I like to set up some values in the CSS variables, since that way I can reuse them all over my project. And if I ever need to make some changes, I only need to do that in one place. Eventually, there's going to be way more values than that, but we'll just start with 3 and then we'll slowly progress. And I guess I'm going to do that right after HTML, where I'm just going to go with root. Now, if you're not familiar, essentially, this one just has a bit more specificity. But at the end of the day, both of them target the root element, which is the HTML. And then if we want to set up a CSS variable, we go with hyphen hyphen and then the name. And in my case, I'm going to go with heading font. And essentially, instead of hard coding here for all my headings, I'll just take out the value, the spectral one, copy and paste. And then instead of hard coding, we're going to go with var and then whatever is the variable name, which of course is heading font. So that's first. Then we'll copy and paste. And for time being, we'll have 3 variables. We'll have heading font, then body font, and then we'll also have the small text one. Small and then text. When it comes to body font, we'll use this one, the Carla one, of course. And again, we just need to change this around where we're not going to be hard coding that. We'll say body and font. And when it comes to small text, I actually use the EMs, since in my opinion, it's better if I set that text based on a parent, effectively based on the surrounding text. And just to showcase that, if you navigate to the default starter, you'll notice here that I have the label, I have the input, and this is going to be a form alert. And then both of these, the label and also the form alert, is actually using this small text. And essentially, whatever is the size for my input, the font size for my input, then this is going to be smaller based on that value. And in my opinion, it just makes a little bit more sense. Now, if you want, you can leave it to the REMs, but that's the reason why I changed this around and set it equal to EMs. And once I have that third value, let's just scroll down, and where we have the small and text small, we'll make some changes where I always like to use hyphens instead of underscores. And then when it comes to font size, again, we're going to go with var, and then we'll be looking for that small text. So that should do it for my CSS variables, at least for now. And then as far as the setup, well, we don't have the colors yet, so I'll just leave these hard-coded values. But for the paragraph, I actually like a bigger margin in the bottom. So I always go with 1.5 REMs. And there's also one more thing that I always like to add for the paragraphs. If you take a look at the big browser window, you'll notice how this paragraph is essentially spanning all across the screen. And in most cases, you actually want to set up some kind of max width. Notice, what is easier to read, this or this? And in my opinion, of course, it's this one. Therefore, I always set my paragraphs between 35 to 45 EMs. So I go here with max width, and in this case, I'm just going to set it equal to 40 EMs. After that, we have all the headings, and effectively, even though it looks somewhat okay over here, when you have just text, margin tops, in my experience, is always a pain, because as you're building the application, you always need to check for those values. And in most cases, when you have some kind of app you're going to be overriding those values anyway. So it's always my preference to remove that margin top. And the way I do that, I just go with margin 0 here. And then I say margin bottom, and we'll set that equal to 1.38 and then REMs. So effectively, I do keep the bottom margin. That's nice. That one, you don't need to override that often. But then when it comes to margin top, I just always like to keep it as 0, just like they do with heading 1. And then, of course, if you ever need to add it as you're working on a project, you can always do that. And I also always prefer set my text and transform equal to capitalize. I think it just looks a little bit better. That should do it for my tweaks as well as the type scale code overview. And before we move on to the colors, there's a few more things that I want to do. First, I want to select all the elements as well as after and before and set box sizing equal to the border box. So that's one of those things that Normalize does not do, and therefore we'll have to add it manually. The placement is really up to you. In my case, I'm going to do that above the import, and I'll simply say that I want to select all the elements as well as after and before. So we go here with after pseudo element as well as the before pseudo element. And for all of them, we want to set box sizing equal to the border box. So that way, if I ever add a padding, the width of the element is not going to get bigger. Effectively, that padding will be applied on the inside. And after that, I just want to quickly deal with this link as well as the unordered list. And when it comes to link, my base styles are following, where I just go with link tag, and we're going to go with text decoration, and we'll set it equal to none. So effectively, I just want to remove that annoying underline, and that's going to be for all the links. And then, of course, I also have my unordered list, and here I just say list style type is equal to none, and we'll also set padding equal to 0. So that way we won't have that extra space. And once we have added all of these changes, now, of course, we can start dealing with colors. Nice work. We have our fonts. So now let's get some colors for our project as well. And in general, colors is one of those things where you can do it in a million different ways. So the following is just my approach, and therefore feel free to tweak it as you like. So if you need different setup for your own project, of course, I encourage you to do that. As a minimum, I always like to set up the following colors. The primary, which is just going to be the primary color for our project. In this case, I have this purple one. Then gray one, which is going to be used for the background. But for both of these, we'll have to set up some shades. So for the time being, they will be just commented out. And then I have black, white, red light, red dark, green light, and green dark with the following values. And as far as these ones, I actually got them directly from the Bootstrap library. And effectively, I use them for alerts. So if I have some full-blown alert like this, or if I have something in a form, whether that is a success or a failure. So for the success, I use the green one. And then, of course, for the error, I use the red one. And the same goes for alerts. The base styles I actually got from the Bootstrap. And effectively, what I want to do right now is just take all of this code and copy and paste. So if you want to follow along, just navigate to the repo, grab all of these values, and then where you have the root, it's always my preference to set them up all the way at the top. So colors, then primary grid, and then we have the rest of the values. So in here, let's just say fonts, and then eventually we'll add more variables. So rest of the vars. And of course, at the moment we don't have the alerts, correct? So we'll just test them out with headings. So if you want to go here, just set up a color for all the headings, and we're going to go with var, And then let's go with that red one, red dark. Of course, the moment I save, notice all my headings have that red color. So we know that our code works. And now we just need to decide on the primary color. And for that, I provided some resources. So we have this cooler site here, as well as the happy hues. Now I'll spend the entire video later on happy hues. So for time being, just remember that you can go here and you have a bunch of options here for the site colors. And then if you like any of these values, just grab it here and set it up as your primary one. And as far as the font pair, well, I already covered that, correct? So where we have the font pairs, we have the list, and it right away tells us what colors are being used in the site. So if you like any of these ones, just set it up as your primary color. And then lastly, the coolers one over here, just navigate, and then you have this generator. And in order to get new set of colors, just press on spacebar and notice you'll be getting these colors. If you want to get some matching ones, you can toggle, or I'm sorry, you can lock this one and then you'll get some matching colors, and then you can keep on locking. And if you want to pick this color, for example, I like this one for my primary, I just copy hex and set it in my project. Again, in my case, I already picked the purple one. So we'll set up the shades in the next video. But for the time being, where we have the colors and where I have the primary, I'll just remove that comment. We'll simply go with primary 500, and you'll see why we're doing that in next video. And then I'm going to go with hashtag 645 and then CFF. That should do it for this video. And the next one, we'll set up some shades for the primary color as well as the gray one. As you can see in the cooler site, they offer you nice color palettes. But the thing is, you're not going to build the site by just using these colors. Because I hate to break it to you, but the site is going to look pretty hideous, regardless of what kind of palette you set up over here. So a better approach is to use that primary color as well as the gray one and then get the shades. And usually a question that I get, well, where I can get the color shades. And we simply need to utilize our search engine. And here we'll say color shade generator. That's the one that we're looking for. And then look for this option. And I believe the name is Shadow World. So we navigate bravely here, and then we right away have this nice interface where essentially we just need to apply the color. So we need to provide the color value. And in my case, since I already have the purple one, I'll just grab it here. But then if you picked a different color, please use that one. Then copy and paste. Make sure that you add the hashtag. So effectively here, they're looking for the hex value as far as I have checked. And then notice this 10%. That just means how the shades are generated. So the smaller the percentage, if you're going to go here with 1, then effectively you'll get these 100 shades. Now, the bigger the number, the less values you're going to get. So in my case, I don't want to have 100 values. I actually only want 10. That's why I will go with 20%. So notice now effectively I have what? 12 values, correct? So I start here with the white one and I all the way end up here with the black. And then the rest of them effectively is just dividing that by 5. So with every value, I'm changing 20%. So I start with 80, 60, 40, and of course you can read the rest. So in here we have lighter tones, and in here we have the darker ones. So simply what we need to do is set up more CSS variables. And effectively it's going to look something like this, where I'm going to go back to my project and I want to go with primary, and then we'll start with 100. So this is going to be the lightest color, and therefore we'll pick this one. Now, I don't suggest picking the white because we already have the value. Pick the actual color value, the one that is 80%. And then copy and paste over here. And then you want to set up Same thing for primary 200, 300, 400, and then 500 you already have. And then you go with primary 600, 700, 800, and 900. So in my case, I'll pause the video. I'll set everything up and I'll resume once I have all my shades set up correctly in CSS as CSS variables. And once I'm done adding all the values, again, let me go over the setup where we go with primary and then 100. So this is going to be the lightest shade of the primary color. And then we go with primary 900. And of course, this is going to be the darkest one. And all the variables match the values that we have here in the shadow world site. So you generate those shades. And then, of course, this is going to be the color that you picked. And then these are going to be the lighter shades. And of course, in here, we have the darker shades. And once you have this in place, now let's deal with the gray colors. And when it comes to gray, you have a few options. Either you can do the same thing where you go to the coolers and then pick the gray color that you like. And then again, generate those shades. Or there's actually a better option, at least in my opinion, and that is using two libraries. So we can use either Bootstrap or we can use a Tailwind. And if you're not familiar, Tailwind is a very awesome library. And what's really, really cool is they provide a lot of awesome resources for us. And one of those things are the colors as well as the shades for the colors. So if you click on the link that I provided, you'll navigate to this site where essentially we can get the gray colors and more specifically all the shades as well. And the same goes for the primary. If you don't want to spend time looking for the primary color, trust me, you can pick any of these ones and notice how we right away get these values. Now in here, they add this 50 as well. And therefore we'll do that with the gray color. But in my case, I'm not going to add 50 to my primary. I'll just leave it the way it is right now. And also, I want to mention that if you have looked at my source code, you'll notice that I used to set up this as HSL value. And let me just showcase how we can change that in Visual Studio Code over here like this. And essentially, the color is the same. And effectively, why some people advocate for using HSA value over the hex one is because it's easier to see this color change when you actually see the percentages. Now, this is not a HSL video, so I'll just leave it at that. And if you have seen that I'm using HSL, I actually have recently switched back to the hex value. Now, maybe later, again, if you take a look at the repo, maybe 2 years from now, I might use again HSL, but as of now, I went back to the hex values instead. So let me change it back to the hex value. And now let me set up the gray colors. And effectively for this purple one, I'm going to go with this one with blue gray. And the idea is exactly the same where you want to set up those CSS variables. And in this case, I will start with that 50. So we're going to go here with gray and we'll set it equal to 50. Let's move this sucker up. And then as far as the value, well, I'm going to get this one. And then I go with primary 100, 200, and hopefully you get the gist. And now, of course, you can see where I got these CSS variable names from, because essentially that is a convention. So let me stop the video and I'll resume it once I'm done. And once I'm done setting up my gray colors, next we'll start using them. And effectively, we have two options. We can either right away use these values here in our selectors, or we can set up another set of CSS variables and then just set the values equal to these variables. And if this doesn't make any sense, don't worry, I'll explain everything in a second. So let's start with the first approach where, as far as the background, I'm simply going to go with my hyphen, and then we're looking for gray. And I usually go with the lightest gray But if it's too light for your liking, then of course you can use a darker one as well. So if you want a darker one, just go here with 100 and notice as you're changing the shade, the background also gets darker. I said, in my case, I go with lightest gray. And then when it comes to actual text color, I go with the darkest gray color. So I don't go with black. I actually go with the darkest gray color, which of course is gray 900. So let's change it around where we will go with hyphen hyphen, and then we select over here gray 900. So that is one approach. And the second approach is setting up two CSS variables. Now, why I prefer the second approach? Well, simply that way I have variables that I'm going to use all over my document, and then they'll be set equal to some kind of variable coming from my colors. And that way, if I ever need to change something, I just need to do that in one place. Simply, I just think that this approach adds a bit more consistency to our project. So in here, I'm just going to go with background and color, and I'll actually set it equal to my gray one. Again, the values will be exactly the same, but the difference is that now all over my project, I'll use either this one or the text color. And then if I ever need to change something, I just do that in one place. Whichever option you prefer, just go with it and you'll be in good shape. So in my case, I'm going to go with text color and we'll set it equal again to the darkest gray, like so. And then where we have the body, of course, now we're not looking for the gray color directly. We're going to go with background color here. And then we'll do the same thing for the color. So let me go here, hyphen, hyphen. And then, of course, we're looking for the text color. And lastly, I just want to mention that, of course, you're not limited to just using Tailwind. You can also do the same thing with the Bootstrap, where this link goes directly to their color site. And here, again, not only you can pick the colors, but you can right away get these shades as well. And like I mentioned all the way in the beginning of the video, there's tons and tons and tons of more resources that you can find, but these are the ones that I prefer using. In my opinion, they just get you up and running the fastest. If you have some better approach, use that one. At the end of the day, what you're looking for is some kind of primary color with a bunch of shades. The same goes for the gray, which we use for the background. And then at the very end, you either use those values directly in your selectors or you set up another set of CSS variables. And as far as the values, well, you pick the variables that hold the color values. And while we're still on a topic of colors, if you remember the very, very beginning of the video, I said that there's a million ways how we can do that. And one of the ways is actually using the site Happy Hues, which effectively provides all of these nice color choices where on the left-hand side, I can just pick the color palette and it right away gives me a nice example how it's going to look like. So if you have a smaller project or you just prefer picking your colors this way, you can definitely do so. So come over here and then choose whichever palette makes the most sense to you. And then just keep on scrolling and you'll right away see which colors you need to set up. Now, I still suggest setting them up as variables. You don't have to go this long route and set up the shades, but I still suggest setting them up as variables because that way, if you ever need to change something, of course, you just need to do that in one place. So, of course, with this approach, the setup technically is going to be a bit more faster because you just come over here and set them up. So you don't have to set up 10,000 shades for the primary color or the background color. Beautiful. And once we're done with the colors, believe it or not, the hardest part is over. Essentially, we just want to add a few more CSS variables and then build few elements that we often use in a project. And since we're going to use these variables a bit later, I will reference few of my React projects just so you can see them in action. And the first extra var that I want to set up is border radius. And my syntax is going to be following border, and then a radius. And I just always go with 2.5 REMs. Sorry, 0.25 REMs. And of course, the border radius is this property. So essentially, it controls those around corners. And next one up, we have letter spacing. Should be pretty self-explanatory. It just set up spacing between the letters. And I always like to start with 1 pixel, basically a very small one. And then if I ever need to increase it, then of course I add that value specifically. Then we have a transition. And essentially this is going to control how and in how long the transition takes place. So essentially a change from one state to another one. So imagine this scenario, you have some images, and as you're hovering, you want to apply some changes. And notice how, of course, it's not happening instantly. It happens over time. So this is what we're controlling with our transition. And in here, I go with pretty default values. I go with 0.3 seconds. That is in how long. Then I set up ease in and out. And lastly, I just say that I'll apply that to all the properties. Then we have max width and fixed width. So let's set up the values and I'll show you in a second. So we're going to go with max width, and my preference is to keep it either 1170 or 1120. Again, that is just my preference. Some people have it bigger, some people have it smaller. Doesn't really matter. And we're going to go with fixed width. And this one effectively is just set up for some kind of element if you always want to keep that width. Now, this also changes. It's not set in stone. For this example, I'll set it as 600, but of course, it depends really on the project. So we're going to go here with fixed width. And like I said, I'll set up to 600. And in order to show you a max width, I'm going to navigate to one of my projects and notice how everything is lined up. And effectively, the way I do that is by setting up that max width on all the sections. So for the nav bar, I set 1, for the hero, and then products and all that. And if you take a look specifically, notice here, I have this max width and I'm using the variable. So every time I'm adding a new content, I make sure that the parent container is always using that max width. Now, again, the actual value might change. You might go with 1200 pixels. You might go with 900 pixels. Doesn't matter, but the entire idea is that you have some kind of value. And then the more content you add, you always make sure that that content is also using that max width property. And as far as the fixed width, well, simply notice here this form, I'm using the fixed width on that. So regardless of the screen, I just make sure that it's not bigger than that certain size. And of course, on a small screen, it's going to depend on percentage. Usually what I like to do is set up 90%, like so. But then as the screen size gets bigger, I always like to set up that it doesn't get bigger than that value. Now, in this case, it is 500 pixels, but of course, in our example, we have it as 600. And then we have shadows. And for that, we'll use the Tailwind library. And if you want to see them in action, essentially notice how as I'm hovering over the form, the shadow is changing. So as I'm hovering, it actually gets bigger. So this is what we're going to control with the box shadows. And if you navigate back to the repo, all the way in the bottom, we have a box shadow one. So just open the link and then you'll navigate to the page where you can get nice box shadows from the Tailwind library. Now I go starting with a shadow. So I don't use the small one. And then you're looking for this first value. And then I take shadow medium, large, and extra large. Now I use different naming. Usually what I like to do first is to set up the comment, the box, shadow, and then we're going to go with hyphen, hyphen, and then shadow 1. So this signals that it is the smallest shadow. And of course, I just want to take the value. So here, copy this one, and of course, paste. and I set the remainder of the shadows in this fashion. So I guess in this case, let me do that together. It shouldn't take too long. So let me just first, I guess, set up these variables. So shadow and then 2, and we're just going to copy and paste. And as far as the value, I'll copy and paste this one. Then we'll change it to 3 and 4. And let's just take these ones. So large and the extra large. And my typical setup is following, where I set up the small shadow, either 1 or 2, as a base. And then as I'm hovering, then I increase to 3 or 4. So let's take this one as well and copy and paste. And excellent. We're done setting up our CSS variables. So now we can start building some commonly used HTML elements. Nice work on setting up CSS variables. And the first HTML element that could use some default styling is an image. So I went out to Pexels and got this nice computer image. And I simply want to go to my index.html. And then right after my unordered list, I'm going to go with my img element. And then as far as the source, of course, I'll point to my computer JPEG. And for the alternative, let's also write computer. And everything is great. Life is awesome. However, we have a major issue. And that major issue is the fact that by default, images are going to be using their own width and height. And normally, in pretty much any project, you want to control that width and sometimes height with the parent container, whether that is a 2-column layout, whether that is a 3-column layout, and hopefully you get the gist. Now, the good news is that we don't need to do much. We simply need to add few properties. Now, in my case, I'm going to go with class, and I'll explain why I prefer using class over directly targeting the element. So in here, I'm just going to go with pretty generic img, and then back in the main CSS, I'll scroll down and right past the unordered list. I'm going to go with my img class, and I'm looking for width 100%. So now it's going to depend on a parent. So it's going to be spanning 100%. Then we want to go with a display block, and I'll cover that once I add the parent container, the direct parent container. And then lastly, we're going to go with object fit, and same deal. I'll show you with an example what the property is doing. So that's an awesome start. I can set my image and notice how it's now not spanning outside of my screen. So essentially, it is constrained by my document. And in order to showcase these two properties, we'll simply go to index.html, and then we'll just set up some temporary container. So I'm going to go here with container. That's my div. I'll place it inside. And then let me just add a few properties on it. So we're going to go here with container. I'm going to go with width, and I'll set it equal to 40% of the screen width. Then we'll go with border, and we'll set it up as 5 pixels solid. And then let's go with our primary color. And let's also add maybe a border radius. So border radius, we might as well use these properties. So border radius, and we'll set it equal to our variable. So border and radius. Now here I have a tiny bug. I didn't add the semicolon. And then let's save. Let's see. Okay. That looks about right. Notice, so the parent now has the 40%. And since we have this 100% on our image, of course, now the image width depends on the container. So if I'm going to set this up to a 50%, of course, my image is also going to be 50%. And in such a way, we can set up, of course, the columns and whatever we want. So now, of course, the image depends on the parent. And I also want to add a max width here, since we set up in a previous video. So I'll set up my max width property, and I'll set it equal to my CSS variable. So now if I go to the big screen, now, of course, the container is going to be spanning more, and the same goes for the image. Now, as far as these two properties, so we have here a display block and object fit. Well, the story goes like this, where images by default are inline. And if you don't add this display block, you'll have this weird empty space in the bottom. That's why you always want to set them up as display block. So now, of course, we don't have the space. And as far as the object fit, well, if I'm going to set up the height, whether for the container or for the image, just remember that if you're setting up for the container, you'll also have to go here with 100%, which I'm not going to do. I'm going to set my height directly here. If you do that, if we don't have the object fit, we'll be distorting the image. So let me go here and comment this out and notice how the image is distorted. So if you want to keep the same aspect ratio, you need to go with object fit, and then as far as the value, pass in the cover. So this is just going to make sure that image is always going to be trying to span as wide and high as the container, and it's going to keep the aspect ratio. And just to showcase these properties in real life, let me navigate here to my React store and then notice the image here. So we have here display block. So, and if I comment this out, I have this space, and the same goes for object fit cover. Notice how the ratio changes. And with this setup in place, now, of course, we can talk about why I use the IMG class instead of directly targeting the image. So you can definitely do so. You can go here with IMG. And by the way, this was just for demonstration purposes. I'll remove it, and everything is going to work the same. Now, my issue with this one is the fact that once in a while you have logo, for example, as an image. And in that case, I don't want that default setup where it's spanning 100%. And effectively, a workaround is following where I need to go with IMG, and then I need to use the not. And then, of course, I can pass in either the class that I have for the logo or maybe a selector or whatever. So that's definitely an option that you can use if you're targeting all the images. And there's image where you don't want to use these properties. Yes. But in my case, I just feel that I have more control if I have the IMG class. And that way, every time I'm adding the image, and I do want to use these properties, I do want to use the width, the display block, and object fit, then of course they're being applied. Again, that is just my preference, and it's really whatever you like. If you like adding to all the images, then just use the element selector. And then if you'll have a case where you don't want to apply them, then remember that in CSS we have not operator, or if you are like me, then you can just set up the class, and then every time you have the image, then just add that class and those properties will be applied. Nice. And once we're done setting up images, up next we have buttons. So in here I have alerts right after that, but we're going to go with buttons next, and then we'll deal with alerts. And essentially this is just going to be a nice default button that you can always use. And here is the hipster version. And as you can see, setup is pretty much the same, just the colors are a little bit different. And we'll start here in the index HTML, where of course we want to create those two buttons. And again, you have two options. Either you can target the element, so the button element, or again, I'm going to go with my class. And the reasoning is same as with the images. Essentially, I feel I have more control if I have that class. Otherwise, there's some projects where essentially you have all these nice default setups, but you just end up overriding those styles because the layout in that case and the use case is a little bit different. So therefore, I feel I have more control if I have that class. So we're going to go here, button, I'll add class, we'll say BTN, and in here we'll write a regular button. And we also need to remember that technically we need to add a type and set it equal to button. I'll copy and paste, and we're going to go with BTN and hipster. So that's going to be that button with a little bit different styles. And in here, let's just say hipster and button. And once we save, we should see two buttons. And you know what? I'll add a line break here, just so we have a little bit of distance. And as far as the main CSS, I'm going to target my BTN class. That should be on both of them. Let me double check. So, yep, I have this class on both of my buttons. And then as far as the values, Well, we simply want to start with cursor pointer. So as we're hovering, we'll have that nice cursor. So cursor pointer. After that, we want to go with color. And in here, I'm going to be targeting my CSS variable, and that is going to be the white color. And here, let me fix it. So that should do it. Yep. And after that, we're going to go with a background. Then we'll set it equal to our primary color. That's going to be our default button. And as you can see, it has the border, but actually in this case, I want to set border equal to transparent. Another option, you can go with border none, but I always like to go with transparent one. Then let's add right away that border radius that we have. So here, let's set it up as border radius hyphen hyphen, and we're looking for the CSS variable. After that, we'll go with our letter spacing. Remember, that is another CSS variable that we set up. Okay, awesome. And we'll add a little bit of padding. So padding is going to be 0.375 REMs, top bottom, and then 75 REMs left and right. So now, of course, our buttons are a bit bigger. And you know what? Let me zoom out a little bit over here. And then we want to add that box shadow here. So box shadow. And like I said, I'm just going to go with the basic one first. So shadow 1. And then lastly, we want to set up our transition. So as we're hovering, we'll apply some changes. And of course, we want those changes to happen over time. Therefore, we'll use the CSS variable. And then lastly, let's use the capitalized one as well. So text transform. And we're going to go with capitalized. So that's our default button. And notice as we're hovering, of course, we have this cursor. So now let's just set up a few more styles. We're going to go with BTN hover. So as we're hovering, I just want to change the background color to a primary 700. So let's just copy this one and change the value. So now, of course, notice this is going to be a bit darker. And then also I want to add that box shadow, a bigger one. So in here, let's go with box shadow, and we're going to be looking for number 3. Again, if you want to go with the second value for the shadow and then set this up to 4, that's definitely an option. And we have our nice default button. Now we simply need to do the same thing with a hipster. So this is going to take pretty much all the styles that we have over here, but we just want to add a little bit different colors, just in case you ever feel like you don't want the regular button, you want a hipster button. So in here, I'm going to go with BTN, hipster, and that will be equal to a color. And the color is actually going to be now primary. And the background is going to be primary, but it's going to be a lighter color. So let me find it here. That's my primary 200. And as far as the box shadow, I think I'm going to leave it the way it is. And now we simply want to take this one and look for the hover. And as we're hovering, we'll change the background one as well as the color. So let's take these ones. And as far as the values for the background, and I have one too many curlies. For the background, we're going to go here with 700. And then for the color, we'll go with 200. So as I'm hovering, this is going to get darker. And actually, my color is going to get lighter. And lastly, there's also going to be a form eventually here. And then in the form, I like to use the same button. However, in most cases, I like my button spanning the size of the form. And we simply can do that by setting up another class. We'll call this BTN block, and we'll just say width 100%. Again, we're not going to see that button right now unless we set it up over here. But you will be able to see, of course, that button once we set up the form. And lastly, before we move on to alert, let me just mention that as far as display, my preference is setting this up as inline block, so that way the vertical margins are also respected. And when it comes to centering, I always start with the parent. So since, of course, this is inline block, I can go to the parent and then decide where the button is going to be positioned, whether left, right, or center. Now, if I cannot do that, then of course I change it and I go with display block, come up with some kind of width For example, in this case, I could go with 200, and then the same deal, we go with margin, 0, and auto. Now, of course, if you do want to have some margins top bottom, you add them over here. But by default, I like to go with this display inline block, and then depending on the situation, I might change it to display block. Beautiful. And once we have the buttons in place, now let's work on those nifty alerts. And essentially, again, the width for the alert is going to be controlled by the container. So in this case, of course, they're spanning all across, but normally, at least it's going to be that max width, the one that I'm setting for the section. Now, if it's going to be placed even in a smaller container, then of course, it's going to be even smaller. So don't think that just because they're spanning all across in this example, that alerts always will do that. No, they're just here because I have no parent container for them, apart from the actual document. And of course, now I just need to look for my div, and we want to add some classes, alert. And then the first one will be alert danger. And second one, you guessed it, is going to be alert success. One is going to use the red color, and the other one is going to use the green color, hello from, and we'll call this danger. And in here, we'll say hello from success. And once I save my index.html, I simply need to navigate to my main CSS and right after the buttons. And you know what? Before we continue, I actually always like to set up some comments here. So in here, I'll say font. And then we'll keep on scrolling. And right after the image, we're going to go with buttons. And then let's just set up alerts. And as far as the setup, we'll target the alert first. That's going to be essentially the default styles. And then as far as the colors, well, of course, we have the second set of classes, correct? We have one for danger and one for success. So in this one, we'll set up the red one. And then the next one, of course, is going to be green. So let's start by targeting the alert. We'll add the same padding as for the button. So 0.375. And then as far as left and right, we're going to go with 0.75 REMs. And we'll add a little bit of margin bottom. This is going to be equal to 1 REMs. Then as far as the border color, I'm going to go with transparent again. And then let's add that border radius. So border radius, and we're going to go with our CSS variable, the border radius one. And if I scroll down, I can see that something is happening, but of course we will have to add those colors. And for the danger one, we're going to go with alert and danger. So we target the class first. And then for the color, remember we have that red dark, and then we'll copy and paste. And we just need to add those semicolons. And of course, this will be a red light, but it's going to be set for the background color. So background. And once we save, that is going to be our alert. And then I guess let's navigate to index.html. And we're just going to add some line breaks here, just so we have some space in between them. And I'm going to add a few more. So now I have 3 of them. And then back in the main CSS, we simply want to take this whole thing, copy and paste, and we'll just change this around to success. And as far as the colors, well, it's not going to be red. It's actually going to be green. So we have one for dark and then one for light. Go here with green. And then once we save, of course, we have our 2 nice alerts. All right. And once we're done with our alerts, now let's tackle the big beast, and that is going to be the form. Now, I must warn you right away that when it comes to forms, since we have labels, since we have inputs, we also have some alerts, it gets a little bit tedious. However, keep in mind one thing, where the whole idea of this default setup or the global styles is the fact that once you're done with this, anytime you need a form, you simply can grab those values and you'll be up and running in no time. So yes, the initial setup might feel like a waste of your time, but just remember, once you're done, anytime you need a basic form, you'll have the code already in no time. And we'll start simply by just setting up the index.html. So first, let's set up the structure. And then, of course, in the next video, we'll spend on actually setting up everything in the CSS. And we're going to start right after the alerts, where I'm going to go with my form. And the same deal. If you want to target the element, you can definitely do so. And the same goes for labels, for inputs, and all that. And I'm not going to repeat myself, but I'll use classes. Just keep in mind that you can also use the elements if that is your preference. So in my case, I'll call this a form. And then inside of it, we're going to go with heading 4. And we'll call this contact form. Let's save it. Let's see. Okay, that's an awesome start. And now we simply want to go with div. So my preference is always place the label and input in a div, because that gives me a little bit more control. And I'm going to add a class of form row to that div. Then we place a label. And as far as the for, since I know that for this particular input, the ID is going to be name, of course, I'm going to go with value of name. And then I'll add a class of form label. And then instead of the label, let's just write a name. And then right next to the label, let's place our input. It's going to be a text input. We'll have the placeholder and we'll say there, hello there. And I also want to add a ID of name and then the class of input. So class, and we're going to go with form and input. Now I want to take my whole div like so, and then copy and paste 2 times. And then eventually there's also going to be one for text area, but we're not going to worry about this one right now. Now we simply want to go with a second one, and I want to set up my second one as a number. So here, let's write number, then form label stays the same. The value is going to be number. Then we're not going to use the placeholder in this case. And as far as type, we'll go with number. And of course, the ID is going to be number. And the class will stay exactly the same. And last one will be email. So same spiel. We go here with email. Then name will be email. And of course, we don't have the placeholder. Type also is going to be email. And the ID is going to be email. And lastly, like I said, I also want to set up a text area. And in this case, we're going to go with our form row. And then inside of it, let's place a label for text area. And as you can see, I'm using these generic values because once you'll have the actual form, then of course these values will change. Then let's go with our form label. And inside of it, let's just write text area. And then right next to the label, let's go with our text area element. And you know what, for the time being, I'll just remove all of them and we'll add a class name of form and then text area. And inside of it, we need to set up some kind of default value. So I'll write default value. Then outside of the last div, the form row one, I want to go with my button. And this is going to be the case where I want to set up my button to be the form button. And what that means is that I want to span it all across. So we'll still use that button class. That still stays the same, but we're going to go with btn block and we'll write over here submit. Now, it's not mandatory, but of course you can also add type submit, even though we're technically not going to be submitting the form. So if I navigate to the big screen, this is what I should see. And what's really cool, notice that essentially the button is already like I want. Now, of course, I still need to work on my form, but effectively once I set up the form, the button is going to be ready to go. And again, that's the benefit of setting up some kind of default styles, because that way you don't have to repeat yourself on every project. Beautiful. And once the structure of our form is in place, of course, let's just go to a CSS file and let's add those necessary styles. So right after alerts, we're going to go with form. And since we have a class, of course, we need to target it. So we're going to go here with form, and I'm going to go with 90%. So starting with a small screen, this is always going to be 90% of the screen size. Now, the problem, of course, in this case is going to be the fact that, remember, I have those temporary values for the padding, and this one is quite big. That's why I'm pushing actually my form outside of the screen. So let me make this one smaller a bit. And I think that is already a little bit better. Now, if worse comes to worse, I can always zoom out, and then definitely you'll be able to see everything. So let me try to set up everything. And if something, I can always zoom out. So that's my width, starting with a small screen. But then remember, I also have that fixed width in the CSS variables. So what I'm saying here is set up my form to be max width, and the value will be equal to the fixed width. So it's going to be equal to a 600 pixels, correct? Then we want to add that background, and that will be equal to a white one. So there it is. And of course, we also want to go with border radius, and that is also our CSS variable. And lastly, we want to go with our box shadow here. And of course, that will be equal to a shadow. And I think I'm going to go with a second value. And then after that, I'm going to go with padding, and that will be equal to 2 REMs top bottom, and then 2.5 REMs left and right. And then the last thing we need to solve is the centering. And again, this is the case where you have two options. You either can set up a container here and then use that container to set that form in specific location, whether that's left, center, or whatever. That's definitely always an option. Or you can apply those styles directly on a form. So again, this might be something that changes later. You go with the default one where you're actually setting the centering inside of the form, but then depending on your project, you maybe want to set it center using the container. So that's not set in stone, but for this example, I'm just going to go here with margin and then 3 REMs, top, bottom, and then we'll set up the auto. So now, of course, if I go to the big screen, check it out. The form is exactly in the center. And then we want to go with our form label, and here we'll go with display block since I want to start it in new line. We also want to add a font size, and this is the case where I want to go with that small text. Remember, that was one of the first CSS variables we set up. So essentially, I just want this text to be smaller than the actual input. That's why I go with that small text. And remember that this value depends on EMs. It doesn't depend on the root. It actually depends on the parent. And we'll add a little bit of margin bottom here. So 0.5 REMs. Then we want to go with text transform capitalized. Again, that's just always my preference. And then let's just go with that basic letter spacing. And we have a CSS variable for that. Then we have form input and form text area. And we'll right away style both of them together. So form input and then comma and form hyphen text area. And in here, I'm going to go with width of 100% because I always prefer my input spanning the width of my form. After the width, I want to go with padding, and I'm going to use the same padding. So at this point, if you want, you can set up a CSS variable, because notice how I'm using the same padding for the inputs, for the alerts, as well as the buttons. So that way, if you want, you can control it in one place. And maybe depending on the screen size or depending on the project, it's going to be bigger or smaller. So I'm going to go with padding 0.375 and then 0.75. Then we want to go with border radius. And of course, we do have the variable for that. Then we want to set up a background. And in this case, we're going to go with the lightest background. So we have the gray 50 for the entire project. And now I want to do the same thing for the input. I'm going to go background, and I'm going to use that background color. Remember, that was one of the variables that we set up. So we go here with background color, and that should match exactly to what I have for my entire background. And then as far as the border, we're going to go with border, and we'll set it equal to 1 pixel, solid. And in this case, I'm going to go with gray 200. So let's go here with hyphen, and we're looking for gray. And of course, we want to set it as 200. So that should be our border. And now let's just set up the margin bottom for the form row. And I'm talking about the actual div that has the label and the input. So form row, and we're gonna go with the margin bottom, and we'll be looking for the 1 REMs. Then let's also set up the text area, and remember that we deleted all those manual values. Remember, by default, when you set up the text area, you get the rows and columns and all that. And actually, we'll control that using the CSS. So back in the main CSS, let's go with form text area. And since we already have the width 100%, because we already targeted here with the form input, now I just want to add the height. And that, again, is going to depend on the project. But as far as default value, I'm just going to go with 7 REMs. And once I save, I can see that this text is actually all the way on the right hand side. So just need to go back and set it up over here, I guess. And yep, now everything works. Then we want to work with our placeholder. Remember, we have this hello there. And effectively, I want to make sure that the font family is inherited, because that is sometimes an issue with some browsers. So we'll go here with placeholder and we'll say font family. And of course, we're inheriting from the parent. And then I also want to add a color. So var, and we're going to go with 400. Let's add that value. So it's a little bit lighter right now as far as the color. And then lastly, remember, I mentioned already quite a few times that there's also a use case for alerts inside of the form. Because what if you're trying to submit the value and the server responds with some kind of error? I mean, it kind of makes sense to have some kind of alert here as well, whether that is a success or a failure. Yes, you can always use these ones, but sometimes the actual alert in a form looks a little bit nicer. And we need to go back to index.html, then pick whichever row you want. In my case, I think I'm going to go with third one, show the email. And then remember that we have two options. If we want to go with text small, we can either use the class or we can use the small element. And this is the case where I'm going to use the small element, and then I'll still add a class since we'll have to add some styles. And in here, I'll say form alert, and let's just write, please provide and value. Once we save, we should see the small text. Again, shouldn't be surprised because we have this setup coming from the type scale, correct? Remember, when we got all the font size, we also got this text small. Let me see. Yep, there it is, small and text small. And what I want right now is just set up form and alert. So I'm targeting my class. And as far as the color, again, this is going to depend on a situation. And in most cases, you'll control this dynamically. Now, since I want to showcase what we have, of course, I'm going to go with some kind of color. And in this case, I'm going to go with red. But please keep in mind that normally you'll set this up dynamically. Then as far as the letter spacing, well, we have the CSS variable for that. And then lastly, I want to go with text transform and capitalize. And like I said, yes, it was a little bit tedious, but once you have all of these styles in place, anytime you need a basic form, you'll be up and running in no time. And right after the form, in my default setup, I always like to have a loading as well. And if you want to see that in action, I can navigate to the Comfy Store project, the React project, and once you refresh, notice you'll have that loading displayed. And as far as the setup, it's actually very straightforward, where I want to navigate down in my index.html, and I simply want to add a div with a class of loading. And then back in the CSS, I guess let's start by adding a comment just so we know what we're building. And in this case, of course, as far as the text, it's going to say alert. Okay, awesome. And then, of course, we don't see anything. Don't worry, we will in a second. And we go here with loading. Then we need to come up with width and height. So 6 REMs, and height is also going to be 6 REMs. As always, you can change these values later. Then let's add the border just so we can see something. So we're going to go here with border and then 5 pixels, solid. And as far as the color, I'm going to go with gray 400, but it really depends on your preference. And as you can see, we have a nice box. Now, since I want this to be a circle, I need to go with border radius, and we'll set it equal to 50%. So now we have a circle. And then the way it works is we simply need to set up some border top, and then we'll set up the animation. So we'll go here with border top, and we just need to change the color since we already have the base color for the entire border. And that is going to be equal to border top and color. And we'll set it equal to a primary 500. So our main color here. And then, like I said, we just need to set up the animation. And in order to set up the animation, we go with keyframes. And then what is the name? I'm going to call this spinner. And then as far as the logic, we'll just say 2. And then transform property. And we'll say rotate 360 degrees. 360 degrees here. And then back in the loading div, we want to go with animation. Now, what is the animation name? We'll call this a spinner. Then how long it's going to take? 0.6 seconds. And it's going to be linear, and it's going to run infinitely. So we go here with infinite. Notice, of course, now we have the loading spinner. And similarly to rest of the elements, you have two options. You can either control the position using the container, or you can control it just by setting up on loading. And for time being, I'm just going to say loading, margin, and 0 auto, which effectively will place it in the center. And while we're still on the roll, I also will show you how to set up a decent looking title. And effectively, I want to add some line breaks in between the loading and the title. Then we want to go with our div. And then instead of the div, usually I go with heading 2. And we're just going to say section title. And then we'll also set up a underline. And for this one, I'll add a title underline class. And then once we're done with our HTML, then of course we just need to navigate back to the main CSS. And we'll set up a comment. We'll say here title. And then we'll just start by placing a text in the center. For now, this is what we should see. And we do that by just saying title and then text align. And we'll place it in the center. And then of course we just want to set up the underline. So in here, let's go with title, underline. And we'll start with some kind of background. And for this, we'll go with 500. Then we will also set up some width and height. And I think for the width, I'm going to go with 7 REMs. Then height is going to be equal to 0.5, or I'm sorry, 0.25 REMs. And lastly, we just want to place it in the center. So I'll start over here with margin 0 and auto. And what you'll notice that, of course, all our headings have this margin in the bottom. So this is really up to you. If you want, you can leave it. If you don't like it, then you have a few options. Either you can target a heading 2, since I know that that's the element that's over there, and I can just go with margin and then bottom. And if you want to totally remove it, of course, set it equal to 0, like so. So that's going to be the look. If you want to add some kind of value, maybe a 0.25 is going to work. You can definitely do so as well. Or if you don't like this option, because you might be saying, hey, well, what if I don't have the heading 2 over here? And if you still want to remove that margin from whatever heading you add over there, of course, you can do it in the underline as well, where you go with margin top and then you just go negative. For example, you can go negative 1 REMs. And notice the result is exactly the same.